Victor Hale's gloved fist slammed down on the courthouse steps so hard that the wood cracked beneath his knuckles. "That woman," he snarled, loud enough for half the town to hear, "arrived here with nothing but a bastard child and a sob story, and now she thinks she can stay?" He turned to the sheriff standing beside him, eyes cold as January iron. "I want her gone by Friday, her and that baby both. You tell Whitaker I said so." The sheriff looked at his boots. Nobody argued with Victor Hale in Cutter's Creek, Wyoming. Nobody except, apparently, the one man who had every reason to keep to himself. None. If you've ever watched someone defend a stranger when the whole world told them not to, stay with me. This story is going to stay with you. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The advertisement had been Elias Whitaker's idea, and almost immediately after posting it, he'd regretted it. He'd written it himself at the kitchen table, by the light of a single oil lamp, on a Tuesday night in late October when the wind was doing what Wyoming wind does in October. Not howling exactly, more like complaining. A persistent, low, miserable sound that found every gap in the walls and reminded a man he was alone. Reliable cook needed. Greystone Ranch, 12 miles east of Cutter's Creek. Room and board provided. Inquire at the post office. That was it. 12 words. He'd read them back to himself, decided they were sufficient, and ridden into town the next morning to post them. What he had not written, what he had not thought he needed to write, was no children, no complications, no one who needs anything from me beyond a place to do the job. He should have written that part. He understood that now, standing on the porch of Greystone Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in November, watching the stagecoach from Laramie slow to a stop at the end of his drive. Elias was 41 years old and looked like a man who had spent most of those years outdoors. His face was weathered in the way that Wyoming faces get weathered. Not gracefully, not like portraits in parlors back east, but the way fence posts get weathered, functional, worn in. The kind of face that didn't invite conversation. He had not intended to be standing on the porch. He had intended to be in the south pasture, checking on the cattle fence that his ranch hand Dewey swore he'd repaired, but which Elias strongly suspected had not been repaired at all. But something had pulled him back to the house. Some instinct, or maybe just the specific misery of having nothing to look forward to and wanting to be wrong about that for once. The stagecoach door opened. The first thing that stepped out was a small boot, then a skirt, dark blue, patched at the hem with a slightly different shade of dark blue. Then a woman's hand gripping the door frame hard because the step down was steep and she had, and this was the part that made Elias go very still, she had a baby on her hip, not a toddler, an infant, small enough that the blanket wrapped around him was doing most of the work of keeping him visible. The woman herself was younger than he'd expected. He'd imagined someone matronly, capable-looking, the kind of woman who had spent 30 years cooking for ranch families and arrived with references and a no-nonsense expression. What he got instead was someone who looked like she'd been traveling for 2 days without sleep and was refusing, on principle, to let that show. She had dark hair pinned back with more determination than pins. Her jaw was set. Her eyes, brown, he'd noticed later, the kind of brown that looked almost black in certain light, swept the property once, quick and assessing, the way you look at a place when you're trying to decide if it's better or worse than the last one. She walked toward him. The baby shifted against her hip, but didn't make a sound. "Mr. Whitaker?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like a statement she was daring him to contradict. "That's right," he said. "Clara Bennett." She didn't extend her hand because she needed it to hold the baby. "I answered your advertisement." Elias looked at the baby, then back at her, then at the baby again. "I asked for a cook," he said. "I am a cook," she said. "The advertisement didn't say anything about—" He gestured vaguely toward the infant. "No," she agreed. "It didn't." There was a pause in which the Wyoming wind expressed its opinion of the situation. Behind her, the stagecoach driver was dropping a single worn trunk from the roof, not much in it, by the sound it made hitting the frozen ground. "How old?" Elias asked, because it was the only question that came to mind that wasn't rude. 4 months, Claire said. His name is Noah. 4 months. Elias did the arithmetic without meaning to. 4 months old, and she was already here, 12 miles from town, interviewing for a job that paid in room and board. That told him something. He just wasn't sure yet what it told him, or whether he wanted to know more. "I'm not running a family operation," he said. "I run cattle. I've got 6 ranch hands who need feeding twice a day, and the house needs work. What I need is someone who can cook and keep the kitchen and not—" He stopped. "Not bring complications." Clara looked at him for a moment, not angrily, more the way a person looks at a puzzle they've seen before. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "my husband died 7 months ago. I have $4.60 to my name, and that trunk." She tilted her head toward it. "I can cook anything you put in front of me. I can bake bread. I can stretch a week's worth of supplies into 10 days' worth of meals, and I can do it quietly and without being asked twice. What I cannot do is leave Noah somewhere else. So if that's your condition, I understand it, and I won't argue with you about it." She shifted the baby to her other hip. "But I'd ask you to make your decision fast, because I've been on that coach for 2 days, and I'd very much like to sit down." Elias stared at her. He was not a man who changed his mind easily. His wife, Margaret, had often pointed this out, not always charitably. "You get an idea in your head," she used to say, "and it just calcifies, like a rock in cement." She had not meant it as a compliment. He thought about sending Clara Bennett back to town. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about anything that required a decision. Thoroughly, without sentiment, or at least attempting to be without sentiment. And then Noah made a sound. Not a cry. Something softer than that. A small, inarticulate noise that could have meant anything. Hunger, discomfort, simple curiosity about the man standing on the porch staring at him. And Clara shifted automatically, adjusting her grip, murmuring something too quiet to hear, and the baby quieted. She hadn't looked away from Elias to do it. Her eyes stayed on him the whole time, steady and level, asking nothing but waiting for an answer. "1 week," he said. He heard himself say it before he'd quite decided to. "You get 1 week to prove you can do the job. If it doesn't work, I'll pay your fare back to town." Something flickered across her face. Not relief. She wasn't going to give him that. Something more careful than relief. "That's fair," she said. "Kitchen's in back," he said. "I'll have Dewey bring your trunk in." He turned before he could change his mind. Dewey Marsh had been working Greystone Ranch for 9 years, long enough to have known Margaret Whitaker and long enough to understand what the ranch had become after she died. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, who talked about as much as the fence posts and had opinions about everything, but expressed them mostly through the angle of his hat brim. Hat pushed back meant things were fine. Hat pulled low meant something had gone wrong or was about to. When Elias came into the barn and told him to bring the trunk in from the drive, Dewey pulled his hat back. "Cook finally showed?" he said. "Something like that." "She any good?" "Don't know yet." Dewey waited. When Elias didn't add anything, Dewey went out to get the trunk. He came back 2 minutes later with the hat pulled straight down over his eyebrows. "She's got a baby," he said. "I know." "You're keeping her anyway?" 1 week. Dewey considered this. The boys are going to have questions. "The boys can keep their questions to themselves," Elias said, and went to find something to do in the south pasture. The kitchen at Greystone Ranch had not been properly used since Margaret died 3 years back. Elias could have hired someone in those 3 years. He'd thought about it more than once. But there was something about letting another woman into Margaret's kitchen that had felt for a long time like the wrong kind of moving on. So the kitchen had existed in a state of functional neglect. Meals got cooked. Elias had managed that much himself, badly. And the basic tools were there, but the room carried the specific heaviness of a place where someone had stopped caring. Clara stood in the doorway of it for a long moment. Elias had left her there, told her to get acquainted with the supplies, and retreated. He told himself he was giving her space. Mostly he was avoiding watching her walk around a room that still had Margaret's handwriting on the labels of the spice jars. What he did not expect was to come back inside 2 hours later and find that the room smelled different. He stopped just inside the back door. The smell hit him before anything else. Bread, actual bread, yeasty and warm, in a way the kitchen hadn't smelled in 3 years. There was something else underneath it, onions, broth, something slow cooking that made his stomach inform him, with some urgency, that he had not eaten properly in longer than he'd admitted to himself. Claire was at the stove, Noah in some kind of sling arrangement across her chest, both hands free, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned a long time ago how to do two things at once. She looked up when she heard him. "I found a ham in the cold store," she said. "I hope that's all right, and the flour was getting old. I used what was still good. There's bread coming in about 20 minutes if you want to tell the men." Elias stood there for a moment, and something happened in his chest that he didn't entirely have words for. Not sentiment. He told himself firmly it was not sentiment. It was just, he hadn't expected competence. He'd expected an argument or a disaster, or at minimum a woman rattled by an unfamiliar kitchen. "I'll tell them," he said. He almost said thank you and then didn't, because that felt like admitting something. The 6 ranch hands who worked Greystone Ranch were not, as a group, known for their conversational gifts. There was Dewey, the eldest, who communicated primarily through hat angles. There was Pete Colburn, 23, who talked constantly but rarely said anything. There was the Harmon brothers, Cal and Tom, who finished each other's sentences in a way that was either efficient or unsettling depending on your mood. There was old Royce, who had been old for as long as anyone could remember and was said to have opinions about everything pre-1860. And there was a young man named Garrett who had arrived in August looking for work and stayed because nobody had told him not to. They came to the dinner table that first evening like men who had been eating bad food for so long they'd stopped expecting anything else. Clara put the bread on the table, then the ham, sliced, then a pot of beans she'd somehow coaxed out of the pantry and turned into something that actually tasted like beans were supposed to taste. Then a gravy that Pete Colburn later described to Elias, with genuine emotion, as the best thing that's happened to me all year. Nobody talked for the first several minutes. That was its own kind of review. Old Royce looked up from his plate. "You make this bread from scratch?" he asked. "I did," Clara said from where she stood near the stove. Noah awake and watching the room with the large, solemn eyes of a baby who has recently discovered that the world contains interesting things. "From what we had in there?" "From what you had in there." Royce looked at the bread, looked at Clara. "How?" "Practice," she said. He nodded slowly, the way men nod when they've decided to respect something. "Fair enough," he said, and had another piece. Elias watched all of this from the end of the table and said nothing. But he noticed that Pete Colburn had stopped talking about himself, which was unprecedented. He noticed that the Harmon brothers were arguing, not about ranch work, but about whether the beans tasted better with or without more pepper, which meant they were arguing about something that mattered. He noticed that Garrett, the quiet young ranch hand, had looked over at Noah 3 times with an expression that was trying very hard not to be charmed and failing. He noticed that the table felt, for the first time in 3 years, like people were sitting around it instead of just eating in the same location. He ate everything on his plate and didn't say a word about it. Later that night, he was in the barn doing the last check before dark when he heard footsteps. Clara appeared in the doorway, Noah bundled and apparently asleep against her shoulder. "I wanted to ask," she said, "about the pantry. You're going to run low on a few things by end of next week. If you could get flour, salt pork, and dried beans from town before Saturday, I can make it stretch past that." Elias looked at her. It was the kind of direct, practical question that Margaret used to ask, the kind that assumed she was going to still be here next week and the week after, making decisions about pantry supplies. "I'll write in Saturday," he said. "And the stove's left burner runs hot," she added. "I compensated tonight, but it should be looked at before it causes a problem." "I'll look at it." A pause. Noah made a small sound in his sleep. Clara adjusted him automatically. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I know this isn't what you advertised for." "No," he agreed, "it isn't. I'm not asking for anything beyond the arrangement we discussed. Room, board, fair wages when you decide whether to keep me on." She met his eyes. "I just want to do the work." He believed her. That was the thing. He found irritatingly that he believed her. "The room at the end of the hall," he said. "The lock works from the inside. You'll want that." He paused. "Not because my men aren't decent." They are. Just because a woman with a child should have a lock. Something in her face shifted, just slightly. Something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere in between. Thank you, she said. She went back inside. Elias stayed in the barn for another 20 minutes, doing things that didn't strictly need doing, because the alternative was going back into the house and admitting that it felt, in some small and inconvenient way, less empty than it had this morning. He wasn't ready to admit that yet. 1 week, he'd said. That was the deal. He told himself he'd wait and see. 3 days in, he found Clara at the kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning. She had Noah in a small basket near the stove for warmth, and she was mending one of the ranch hand's shirts, one she hadn't been asked to mend, by lamplight, and she looked up when he came in without any particular surprise, like she'd already gotten used to his early hours. Coffee's ready, she said. He poured himself a cup and stood by the window. You don't have to do that, he said, nodding at the shirt. Cal Harmon's going to lose a button on that cuff in about 2 days, she said, and then it'll turn into 3 buttons and a torn pocket by the time anyone gets around to it. I'm awake anyway. He watched her hands, steady, quick, the particular economy of motion that comes from years of doing things without help. Your husband, he said, and then stopped, because he hadn't meant to say that. Clara's hands didn't pause. James, she said. Fever in March. It moved fast. She kept sewing. He was a good man, not a careful one, maybe, but good. I'm sorry, Elias said, because it was the thing people said. You lost someone too, she said. Not a question. The ranch, she paused, choosing words carefully. The house has that feeling, rooms that are clean but not used. He was quiet for a moment. My wife, Margaret, 3 years ago. I noticed her writing on the spice jars, Clara said. I left them. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the shirt. I figured, she said quietly, you'd tell me when you wanted them changed. He drank his coffee. Outside, the first gray light was beginning to separate the horizon from the sky. She would have liked the bread, he said. It came out before he could stop it, rough-edged, like it had been caught on something on its way out. Clara didn't say anything for a moment, just nodded once, small and careful. That's a good thing, she finally said, for me to know. They sat in the early morning quiet, 2 people carrying the specific weight of grief that comes from losing the person who made a place feel like home, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And somehow that was not uncomfortable. And that was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. On the 5th day, Pete Colburn came to Elias in the south pasture with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that suggested he'd prepared a speech. I just want to say, Pete started, and I'm speaking for the men here, or most of them, Pete, that Mrs. Bennett is the finest cook that's been on this ranch maybe ever, and if you're thinking about not keeping her on, I want you to know that Royce has already told me he'll follow the food, which I think means he'll quit if she leaves, and I personally, Pete, have not eaten this well since my mother was alive, and I don't mean that as a small thing. Elias looked at him. Pete turned his hat over in his hands. That's the speech, he said. You done? Mostly. Go fix the north fence. Pete went to fix the north fence, but as he left, Elias heard him say, under his breath to no one in particular, I'm just saying. Elias stood in the pasture for a moment, alone in the cold. 1 week, he'd told her. The week wasn't even up yet. He pulled his coat tighter and headed back toward the house, and he did not let himself think too hard about whether the direction he was heading had anything to do with the smell of whatever Clara was cooking for lunch, or whether it had to do with something else entirely that he was not, under any circumstances, prepared to name out loud. Not yet. Not with winter still coming, and Victor Hale still out there, and the whole of Cutter's Creek watching to see what Elias Whitaker would do with the woman who'd arrived on his doorstep, with nothing but a baby, and a set of eyes that looked at him like they already knew the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. The week passed the way weeks do when you're waiting for something to go wrong. Faster than you expected, and with less disaster than you'd braced for. Elias never formally told Clara she could stay. He just stopped mentioning the arrangement. The 1-week trial came and went on a Sunday, and on Monday morning she was still at the stove at 5:30, and he was still standing by the window with his coffee, and neither of them said a word about it, and that was that. It wasn't a decision so much as the absence of one, which, Elias had learned over the years, was sometimes how the most important things happened. What changed in the weeks that followed was harder to name and easier to feel. The ranch hands stopped eating like men fueling machinery and started eating like men who had somewhere to be. Pete Colburn, who had previously held the record for talking through every meal without pausing for breath, began asking Clara questions about the food. Not to make conversation, but because he actually wanted to know how things worked, which was a development nobody had anticipated. Old Royce started arriving at the table 5 minutes early. The Harmon brothers had a 3-day argument about whether Clara's cornbread was better than their mother's, which ended inconclusively but with obvious affection for both women involved. And Noah had become, without anyone quite deciding it, the ranch's unofficial resident. He was 5 months old now, then nearly 6, growing into the particular brand of alert curiosity that certain babies have, the kind that makes adults feel studied. He had a way of tracking movement across a room with those dark, serious eyes that made Garrett, the youngest ranch hand, deeply self-conscious in a way he couldn't articulate. "He's looking at me again," Garrett told Dewey one afternoon with genuine unease. Dewey pulled his hat back, things were fine, and said, "Babies look at things. That's what they do." Garrett did not appear comforted. Clara let the men hold Noah when they asked, which at first no one did directly, and everyone did indirectly. It started with old Royce, who simply stood next to Clara one evening after supper with his arms in a position that was not quite extended and not quite at rest. And Clara handed Noah over without comment, and Royce stood there for 10 minutes looking at the baby with an expression nobody on the ranch had ever seen on his face before, something stripped of its usual armor. "He's got his mother's eyes," Royce finally said. Clara looked up from where she was washing dishes. "I think so too," she said, soft. After that, the holding happened naturally, the way most things happen when nobody is forced into them. Elias did not hold Noah. He was careful about that. Careful the way he was careful about other things that had edges. He acknowledged their existence and gave them a respectful distance. But he watched. That he couldn't quite stop himself from doing. He watched Clara on a Thursday morning when the cold came down hard and unexpected, and she spent 2 hours adjusting the heating in the bunkhouse because Garrett had developed a bad cough, and she didn't want it turning into something worse. He watched her negotiate with the supply situation in a pantry that was never quite stocked the way it should have been, stretching things, substituting, making decisions quickly and without complaint. He watched her at the end of long days when Noah wouldn't settle, and she'd been on her feet since before dawn. And there was no performance of endurance in it, no "look how hard I'm working." She was just tired and still doing it, the way people do when they don't have the option of stopping. One evening he came into the kitchen and found her sitting at the table with her forehead in her hands, very still. Not crying, just still. Noah was asleep in the basket. The kitchen was clean, dinner had been made and served and cleaned up after. There was nothing left that needed doing, and she had apparently discovered that sitting down was harder than standing. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up, but she knew he was there. "I'm fine," she said to the table. "I didn't say you weren't." A pause. "I just needed a minute." "Take it," he said. He poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat down at the other end of the table and didn't say anything else. She picked up the cup eventually. They sat there for a while, in the quiet, and outside the wind was making its complaints again, and Noah breathed in his basket, and Elias found himself thinking that this exact configuration of things, the lamp, the coffee, another person on the other side of the table, was something he had missed without knowing he was missing it. He didn't say any of that. He finished his coffee, said goodnight, and went to bed. It was Clara who finally cracked the surface of something, about 3 weeks after she'd arrived, on a cold Friday night when the ranch hands had retired early and the house was as quiet as it got. She came to the parlor doorway, a room Elias almost never used anymore, still furnished with Margaret's choices, a horsehair settee and a bookshelf with novels and a braided rug that had cost more than it should have, and she said carefully, "I owe you an apology." Elias looked up from the ledger he'd been staring at without processing. "For what?" "I wasn't entirely honest when I came here," Clara said. She didn't come into the room. She stood in the doorway, which seemed intentional. I told you I answered your advertisement, and I did. But the reason I came this far out instead of applying somewhere closer to town, she stopped. There were other positions. In Laramie. Closer. Elias waited. My husband's brother, she said, and something in her jaw tightened just slightly, the way it does when a person has rehearsed something and is now discovering the rehearsal didn't cover the actual feeling of it. He's in Laramie. He believes Noah should be. He has ideas about what should happen to Noah, since James died. He went to a lawyer about it. She looked at Elias steadily. I needed distance. 12 miles outside of town was easier to defend than a rooming house on Main Street. The parlor was very quiet. Does this brother have a case? Elias asked, because he was a man who went directly at the thing. He has money, Claire said, which, in my experience, is more or less the same thing. Elias set down his pen. What's his name? She hesitated. It doesn't... Clara. The directness of it, her name, no decoration, made her pause. She looked at him for a moment. Aldous Bennett, she said. He's in textiles. He does well, and he believes a widow with no property and no family shouldn't be raising a child alone. Her voice stayed even. He has opinions about what's best for Noah that have nothing to do with Noah. And everything to do with James's estate, Elias said. Her chin came up slightly. What there is of it, he thought about that. He thought about a woman getting off a stagecoach in November with a 4-month-old baby and $4.60, not because she had no other choices, but because the choices closer to home had a man attached to them who wanted something from her. You should have told me, he said. Not angry, just clear. I know, she said. I was afraid you wouldn't take the position if you knew there was a complication attached to it. There's a complication attached to everything, he said. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the shadow of one. Yes, she said. That's been my experience too. He picked his pen back up, not because there was anything left to write, but because he needed somewhere to put his hands. This Aldous Bennett, he said. Has he made any contact since you came here? Not that I know of. If he does, Elias said, you tell me. Clara looked at him. Something moved across her face that he couldn't categorize. Not relief, not gratitude exactly, more like the expression of a person who had been braced for a wall and found a door instead. Why? She asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He considered the question. Because it's my property, he said, and I decide who comes onto it. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough, and Clara seemed to understand the distinction because she nodded once and said goodnight and went back down the hall. Elias sat with the ledger for another hour, not looking at it. It was Dewey who brought the first real trouble, the way Dewey always brought things, quietly, without preamble, with his hat brim pulled so low it was nearly touching his nose. He came to Elias on a Tuesday morning in early December while Clara was in the kitchen and the hands were out and said, Ran into Frank Giddens at the supply store yesterday. Frank Giddens ran the feed store in Cutter's Creek and had a gift for knowing things that were not technically his business. Elias had relied on this quality before and found it irritating in equal measure. He says Victor Hale's been asking about the ranch, Dewey said. Elias kept his eyes on the cattle count in front of him. Hale asks about everything. He was asking specific, Dewey said, about who's living here now. Frank told him there was a new cook. Hale apparently said, Dewey paused, and his jaw moved slightly in the way it did when he was editing something. He said some things about a woman living on a man's property outside of town. The pencil in Elias's hand went still. What kind of things? Elias said. The ugly kind, Dewey said. The kind designed to spread. Victor Hale owned the largest spread in the valley, nearly twice the size of Greystone Ranch, and he had built it through a combination of genuine business acumen and a willingness to do things that other men wouldn't. He was 52, wide through the shoulders, with the particular confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been told no and made to stick to it. He was not liked in Cutter's Creek so much as he was accommodated. There was a difference. He and Elias had existed in a state of mutual non-aggression for years, which was different from friendship and slightly better than hostility. They had occasionally done business. They had occasionally disagreed about land and water rights and the placement of a fence line. The disagreements had been resolved eventually with the specific reluctance of men who both wanted to win and both recognized they couldn't do it cleanly. What Victor Hale did not handle well was being irrelevant, and Elias Whitaker, quietly running his ranch and minding his affairs, had a way of being relevant by accident. People liked him, in the way people like a man who doesn't perform likability, and that was the one thing Victor couldn't purchase. "He's starting a story," Elias said. "Looks like," Dewey said. "About Clara." "About the situation." Dewey turned his hat in his hands. "You know how it goes. Man out here alone, woman moves in, baby's not his. People with nothing better to talk about will talk about it." Elias stood up. "Let them talk." "Elias." "I said let them talk, Dewey. A man starts a fire hoping it burns something down. You don't help him by panicking about the smoke." Dewey looked at him for a long moment. "You gonna tell her?" Elias thought about Clara in the kitchen, about the way she'd stood in the doorway and told him the truth about Aldous Bennett and what it had cost her to do that. The particular dignity of a woman who didn't ask for protection but told you what you needed to know to decide whether to offer it. "Yeah," he said. "I'll tell her." He found her at the work table rolling out biscuit dough, Noah in the sling, flour on her forearm up to the elbow. "Victor Hale is talking about you in town," he said. Claire's hands kept moving. "What's he saying?" "Nothing with specifics, just enough to make people think there's something worth saying." She rolled the dough once more, pressed the cutter down, moved it over. "Has he got something against you? Or is this just—" "He doesn't need a reason," Elias said. "He's the kind of man who picks at things because picking is easy and costs him nothing." "And what does it cost you?" Clara asked. She looked up then, directly, not aggressive but not soft either. "Honestly, what does it cost you having me here if he's going to run his mouth about it?" Elias leaned against the doorframe. "I've had worse problems than Victor Hale's opinion of my household." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. She looked back. The biscuit cutter was still in her hand, dusty with flour, and she had a line between her brows that had nothing to do with the dough and everything to do with the question. "It cost me some goodwill in town," he said, "because she wanted honesty. Maybe some business if he pushes it. Maybe nothing. Depends how far he takes it." "And if I offered to leave?" "I'd tell you no," he said, without hesitation, which surprised him slightly. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked, the same way she'd asked it in the parlor. "Because the work is good," he said. "And because running from a man like Victor Hale teaches him he can run people off, and I won't have that lesson applied on my property." It wasn't the whole truth again, but it was a part of it, and the part he could say out loud. Clara set down the biscuit cutter. "All right," she said, "then I'll stay." A pause. "For what it's worth, I've been talked about before. Small towns have long memories and short generosity. I can manage it." "I know you can," he said. She picked the cutter back up. "I'm making extra biscuits," she said, and her voice was back to practical, deliberately so. "Garrett's still coughing. I want to send some with honey to the bunkhouse tonight." Elias nodded and left the kitchen. He stood in the hallway for a moment, just on the other side of the door, and did not examine why the conversation had felt like something significant, and why the words "I'd tell you no" had come out so fast, with no hesitation at all, as though the decision had already been made somewhere inside him, well before she asked. The first time Victor Hale came to Greystone Ranch in person, it was a Wednesday in mid-December, and it announced itself the way Hale always announced himself, with noise. The sound of good horses moving at a pace designed to be heard, the jangle of expensive tack, the specific energy of a man who expected doors to open at his approach. Elias was in the yard when the horses came through the gate. He didn't move toward them, and he didn't move away. He stood where he was and waited, which was the one thing Victor Hale couldn't stand about him. Hale pulled up. He was on a black horse, well-fed and glossy, and he sat it the way men sit horses when they've paid a lot for them and want people to notice. He had two men behind him who were not ranch hands in any working sense of the word. "Elias," Hale said, friendly, easy, the kind of easy that has nothing to do with being relaxed. "Victor," Elias said, "heard you've had some changes on the property." I hired a cook, Elias said. Not much of a change. Hale looked around the yard with the particular attention of a man inventorying things he might someday want. Young one, from what I hear. Widow. That's her business. Friendly town, Cutter's Creek, Hale said pleasantly. People talk because they care. He smiled. I just want to make sure everything's... He paused, choosing the word with visible enjoyment. Appropriate. Out here. Something in Elias went very cold and very steady, the way things go steady when the situation requires it. My ranch hands have mothers and sisters, Elias said. If one of them heard you use that tone about a woman in my employ, I expect there'd be a conversation. You know how ranch hands feel about conversations. Hale's smile didn't move, but his eyes did, just slightly, recalculating. Now, Elias... Clara Bennett is my cook, Elias said. She works hard. She keeps good order in the house. And whatever notions you're cultivating in town about what that means, I'd suggest you let them go. They're not productive for you. Hale looked at him for a moment. The pleasant expression had thinned. I heard she came here with nothing, Hale said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that wasn't quite casual anymore. A widow, no family, no property. Husband left debts, from what I understand. Something snagged in Elias's attention, but he kept his face neutral. I don't know anything about that. No? Hale looked at him. Maybe you should. A woman in that kind of situation, another pause, can bring trouble with her without meaning to. Old trouble, the kind that follows a person. He turned his horse and rode back out the gate at the same self-important pace he'd arrived. Elias stood in the yard for a long time after. Husband left debts. He didn't know whether that was true. He didn't know whether Hale had invented it, or heard it, or had some reason of his own to know it. But the specificity of it, debts, not just trouble, debts, had the particular texture of something that wasn't being said by accident. He went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table, feeding Noah, looking up when Elias came in with his coat still on and a look on his face that she'd learned in 3 weeks to read. He came here, she said. Not a question. He did. She looked down at Noah for a moment, then back up. What did he say? He said your husband left debts. The kitchen went very quiet. Noah made a small, unbothered sound. Claire's face didn't crumble. That wasn't her way. Instead, it tightened, the same jaw-tightening he'd seen in the parlor doorway, the expression of a person absorbing something they'd been dreading. James did have debts, she said. He died before he could settle them. I knew about most of them. I paid what I could with what we had. She lifted her eyes to Elias. I don't know what Victor Hale knows about my husband's affairs or why he knows it. But I'll tell you this. James kept records. Every payment he ever made, he wrote down. I had those records. A pause. They were in the house we were renting in Laramie. When James died, Aldous Bennett helped me move. Some things were left behind. I didn't realize until later that the payment records were among them. Elias heard what she wasn't saying as clearly as what she was. Aldous has them, he said. I think so, she said quietly. And I think Aldous knows Victor Hale. They're both in Laramie. They both... She stopped. I don't know for certain that they're working together. I don't want to say that without being sure. Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This was not something he'd intended to do. He'd intended to stand in the doorway like a man with distance maintained and options preserved. But sitting down happened anyway, because the situation had the weight of something that needed to be sat down for. Are the debts real? He asked. Not inflated, not invented, the actual number. James paid most of them before he got sick, Clara said. What was left? She calculated visibly. Maybe $40, perhaps $50. He was close to settled. And if Hale is working with Aldous and Aldous has the records, they can make it look like whatever they want it to look like, Clara said. Her voice was flat, not without feeling, full of it, actually, held at a very careful arm's length. Without James's payment records, I can't prove what was paid and what wasn't. It's my word against whatever number they decide to put on paper. Outside, the wind came up hard against the house. Noah, finished eating, grabbed at the edge of Clara's collar with the determined grip of a person who has recently discovered his own hands. Elias looked at the baby, at Clara's hand covering Noah's small fist. "All right," he said. "All right what?" she asked, wary. "I know a lawyer in Cheyenne," he said. "Name of Aldrich. He handled my land dispute with Hale 3 years back, and he doesn't intimidate easy." Clara stared at him. "I can't afford a lawyer." "I know," he said. A long beat. "Elias, don't," he said. "I'm not doing you a favor. I'm protecting my property from a man who comes to my gate looking for an angle." He said it matter-of-factly, looking at the table, and if it wasn't entirely the whole truth, then at least the practical part of it was real. Hale wants something here. He's been wanting something for 3 years, and he keeps trying different doors. This is just a new door. Clara sat very still. "You don't know that this isn't about me." "I know it's not only about you," he said. "Men like Hale don't just pick at widows because it's fun. There's an angle. There's always an angle." She was quiet for a moment. Noah had fallen asleep in her arms with his fist still closed around her collar, pulling her shirt slightly to one side, and she hadn't moved to fix it. "Why are you doing this?" she said, for the 3rd time, and this time it came out different from the other 2. Softer, less guarded. The kind of question a person asks when they genuinely don't know the answer, and the not knowing is uncomfortable. Elias looked up from the table. He could have said what he'd said before. He had the line ready. "My property. My decision. Nothing personal." He didn't say it. "Because some things are worth doing," he said, and the simplicity of it surprised even him. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at Noah, asleep and oblivious and warm. "I'll pay it back," she said. "Whatever the lawyer costs. I'll keep track." "Fine," he said. "I mean it." "I know you do," he said. He got up from the table before either of them could say anything else, because the kitchen had gotten to a temperature, emotionally speaking, that he wasn't equipped to navigate without making some kind of mistake. And Elias Whitaker preferred, above most things, not to make his mistakes in front of witnesses. But he stood in the hallway again, outside the kitchen door, listening to Clara murmur something quiet to the sleeping baby, and the sound of the wind outside, and the lamp making its small warm light through the gap under the door. He thought about Margaret, and how she would have looked at this situation, and what she would have said to him. She'd have been direct about it, Margaret. She didn't have patience for men who talked themselves around things when the thing itself was perfectly obvious. "Elias," she'd have said, "stop pretending you don't know what you're doing." He pushed off the wall and went to find Dewey, because there was a fence to check and a lawyer's letter to write. And those were concrete things that required his hands and his attention, and those were exactly the kinds of things he needed right now. The rest of it, whatever it was becoming, he would manage one day at a time. That was the only way anything in Wyoming ever got managed. The letter to Aldrich in Cheyenne went out on a Thursday, carried by the weekly mail rider who stopped at Greystone Ranch on his way south. Elias wrote it himself, 2 drafts, the first one too long and the second one precise, what he knew, what he suspected, what he needed. He sealed it and handed it over without ceremony and told himself he'd done what could be done for now, and the rest was waiting. He was not good at waiting. He managed it, the way he managed most things that required patience, by finding enough physical work to keep the part of his brain that worried occupied with something more useful. December settled over the valley like a judgment. The cold that came in the second week of the month was the serious kind, not the theatrical cold of early winter that makes people dramatic, but the quiet, grinding cold that gets into the gaps in the walls and the joints of older men and doesn't apologize. The cattle needed more attention. The fence on the north pasture that Dewey had repaired turned out to need repairing again, which surprised no one. The water trough in the east barn froze twice in 4 days. Through all of it, Claire kept the kitchen running the way a good engine keeps running, without fanfare, without being asked to, with the particular competence of someone who has decided that doing the work well is its own argument. She had started keeping a small notebook. Elias noticed it on the kitchen shelf, a brown paper-covered thing, and assumed it was recipes. He didn't ask. A person was allowed their private books. It was Garrett who told him what was actually in it, not as gossip, but with the transparent earnestness of someone who didn't realize he was sharing information. "Mrs. Bennett's been writing down what everything costs," Garrett said, one morning in the barn while they were working through a tangle of frozen harness. "Every meal, what she uses, what it costs at store prices. She showed me once. She's keeping a running total." Elias kept his hands on the harness. "A total of what?" "What she reckons she owes you," Garrett said, and then looked briefly uncertain, like he'd said something he shouldn't. "I mean, she's paying down the lawyer money. In her head. She's been doing it since you said you'd write to Cheyenne." Elias didn't say anything. "I think," Garrett added carefully, "she just doesn't like owing people." "No," Elias said, "she wouldn't." He thought about that notebook for the rest of the morning, the image of it on the shelf, and what it meant that a woman with $4.60 to her name and a baby and someone else's debts hanging over her head was still, meticulously, keeping track of what she owed, not asking for more than she'd been offered, not taking the generosity and running with it, just accounting for it, treating it like a loan instead of a gift because a loan was something she could repay and a gift was something she couldn't, and apparently that distinction mattered to her more than the money. He understood that. More than he would have admitted out loud, he understood it. What he did not understand, and what was becoming harder to avoid thinking about, was the way he'd started looking for reasons to come into the kitchen during the day. Not at meal times. At odd hours, with thin justifications. A question about supplies. A check on the left burner of the stove, which he had in fact repaired but found himself re-inspecting more than strictly necessary. Twice he'd come in simply because Noah was making sounds. Happy sounds. The increasingly conversational noises of a baby discovering that making noise produced results. And he'd told himself he was checking on the household. Dewey had not said anything about this. Dewey communicated his observations through hat angle, and lately the brim had been settled in a position Elias could only describe as knowing, which was its own irritation. The reply from Aldrich came back faster than expected, inside 2 weeks, which meant the lawyer had taken the situation seriously. Elias read it at the kitchen table, Clara across from him because it was her situation, and she had the right, and Aldrich's assessment was direct in the way that lawyers are direct when they want to be useful, rather than billable. "The claim you describe sounds consistent with manufactured debt inflation. If payment records exist and are being withheld by the deceased's family member, that constitutes potential fraud. The challenge is evidence. Without the original ledger or a corroborating witness to the payments made, the claim would rest on Mrs. Bennett's testimony against a documented paper trail, however falsified. We would need either the ledger itself or someone who witnessed a payment, a merchant, a bank clerk, anyone with independent knowledge." Clara read it twice. She set it down. "A witness," she said. "Someone who saw James make a payment," Elias said. "He made them in person," Clara said slowly, thinking it through. "James didn't trust banks much. He paid people face-to-face when he could. Cash." She pressed her fingers to the table. "There was a man at the land office in Laramie, Hector Voss. James paid a land filing fee in cash about 2 months before he got sick. Voss might remember it. He was memorable. He always brought a list and he counted everything twice and he made them write him a receipt on the spot." "Would Voss still be there?" "I don't know," she said. "It's been 7 months." She looked up. "And I can't go to Laramie." "Because of Aldous." "Because of Aldous," she confirmed. "If I walk into Laramie with Noah, Aldous will know inside an hour. His reach in that town is—" She stopped. "He has friends, people who tell him things." Elias thought about it. "I can go." Clara looked at him sharply. "Elias, I have business in Laramie," he said, which was technically true in the sense that he could make it true. "I need to talk to the livestock broker about spring prices anyway. That's a real trip. I just had a stop at the land office." "You don't know what Voss looks like. You don't know the details of the payment." "Then you tell me," he said. "Everything you remember. I'll write it down." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table made shadows of both of them on the kitchen wall, hers with the slight lean of exhaustion, his straight-backed and stubborn. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked, and this time there was something ragged in it, Not the careful version she'd asked before, but the real one underneath, the one that had been building. You've written to lawyers, and you're offering to ride to Laramie, and you repaired the stove, and you didn't even tell me to leave when Victor Hale came to your gate. Other men would have. Most men would have. It's easier. He was quiet. I'm not a simple situation, Clara said. I know I'm not. I came here with complications attached, and they've only gotten more complicated, and She stopped herself. Reset. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to tell me the real reason, because I'm tired of guessing. Elias looked at the table for a moment, then at her. Margaret, he said. He hadn't planned to say it, but it came out. My wife. She had a sister, younger, married a man who turned out to be exactly the kind of man you don't want your sister married to. Margaret spent 2 years trying to help her get out of it, and every time she tried, someone told her it wasn't their business. It was a private matter. The woman had made her choices. He stopped. Margaret's sister died in the winter of '83, house fire. Whether it was an accident or not it was never settled, officially. The kitchen was very still. Margaret never forgave herself, he said. She thought she hadn't done enough. She thought if she'd pushed harder, been bolder, not listened to the people telling her to stay out of it. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She died still carrying that. I watched her carry it for years, and I couldn't take it from her. Clara didn't say anything. She just listened, the way she'd listened that first morning over coffee, with her whole attention and without filling the silence. I don't know if what's happening to you is the same, he said. I don't know how bad it gets. But I know what it looks like when someone's being cornered by people with more power than conscience, and I know what it feels like to stand around watching and call it minding your own business. He set the cup down. I'm not doing that again. Clara's hands were flat on the table. She looked at them for a moment. I'm sorry about Margaret's sister, she said. Quiet. No decoration on it. So am I, he said. So is she. Every day. They sat with that for a while. Not uncomfortably. The kind of sitting with something that means two people have gotten to a layer of each other that was underneath the practical arrangement, the employment, the 1-week trial, all of it, and found something more honest there. It was Clara who moved first. She picked up Aldrich's letter, folded it carefully, and set it on the shelf next to her brown notebook. His name was Hector Voss, she said. He had an office on the second floor of the land registry building on Calhoun Street. He was about 60, heavy-set, wore a green vest. James paid $42 in November of '86 for a land filing. He always got receipts. Voss gave him one. She paused. James put it in an envelope with his other papers. If Aldous took those papers when he helped me move, the receipt is gone. But Voss's records would still show the transaction. Elias took out a piece of paper and wrote it down. All of it. Methodical. Anything else? He asked. There was also a payment to a man named Crane who ran the hardware concern on 5th, $30. Hardware debt James had carried over from the previous year, she thought. And a partial payment to someone at the grain merchant. I don't remember the name. $20. James noted it in his own ledger as a partial on a larger balance. Elias wrote all of it. If I find Voss, he said, and the record exists, we take it to Aldrich. Aldrich builds the case. And if Hale produces a fraudulent debt claim in the meantime, then he's committed fraud, Elias said simply, which is actually useful to us. Clara looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Not surprise exactly, more a recalibration, like a person adjusting an estimate upward. You've done this before, she said. Dealt with Hale legally. 3 years ago, land dispute. He finished writing and set the pen down. He overreached and then tried to paper over the overreach. Aldrich is good at finding the paper. He didn't learn from that? Men like Hale learn that they need to be more careful, Elias said. They don't learn to stop. What? He rode to Laramie the following Tuesday, a 4-hour ride in cold that required serious clothing and a horse with a decent temperament. He took no one with him. Dewey offered, got a look in response, and readjusted his hat to the I'm staying home angle. The land registry office on Calhoun Street was exactly where Clara had described it. Hector Voss was not. The man at the front counter, young and inattentive, told Elias that Voss had retired in August and now lived about 10 minutes north of town on a small property. Elias rode north. Voss turned out to be a square-built man in his early 60s with the careful disposition of a former civil servant who'd spent decades making sure things were written down correctly. He remembered James Bennett. He remembered it specifically because, as he put it, with a mild sort of admiration, the man counted every dollar on my desk, called out each bill by denomination, and then made me read the receipt back to him before he'd take it. He had furthermore kept his own duplicate records of every transaction processed through the land office during his tenure, organized by year, stored in his spare room in boxes that appeared to be labeled in a handwriting that suggested Voss had never entirely left his job, even when he left his job. He found the duplicate receipt in approximately 12 minutes. Elias sat across from the man in his small parlor and watched him lay the document on the table. A carbon copy, hand-recorded, dated November 14th, 1886, $42 paid in cash by one James R. Bennett for land filing fees, with Voss's signature at the bottom. "I'd like to take this to a lawyer," Elias said. Voss studied him. "This is about that widow, isn't it? There's been some talk in town." "There has," Elias said. Voss folded the document and held it for a moment. "James Bennett was an honest man," he said, more to himself than to Elias. "He overpaid me $1 by mistake once, and came back the next day to correct it. In the other direction." He held out the document. "Take it." Elias took it. "I'll need you to be willing to testify to what it shows, if it comes to that." Voss looked at him with the mild certainty of a man who had spent his life being accurate. "Son," he said, "I kept duplicate records for 31 years specifically because I knew the day would come when someone would try to say something happened that didn't, or didn't happen that did. Tell your lawyer where to find me." Elias rode back to Greystone Ranch with the document inside his coat against his chest, where the cold couldn't get to it. Checked. He arrived back after dark. Clara was in the kitchen with the lamp burning low. Noah long since in bed, the notebook open on the table in front of her. She closed it when he came in, not quickly enough to pretend she hadn't been writing in it. He took the document from his coat and laid it on the table in front of her. She looked at it, read it again. "Voss kept copies," she said. "He kept copies of everything, 31 years' worth." She set the document down with the care you give something fragile, which it wasn't physically, but the meaning in it was. "He'll testify?" "Said to tell my lawyer where to find him." Clara sat back in her chair. Something in her face shifted. Not collapsed, not crumbled, but released slightly, a fraction of an inch of tension that had been living around her eyes and jaw for as long as he'd known her. "This doesn't solve it," she said, practical even in relief. "There are still the other payments, and if Hale and Aldous have been talking, there may be a formal claim already coming." "I know," Elias said. "It's still bad." "It's better than it was this morning," he said. She looked at him across the table, and something in her eyes was doing something complicated, something he probably should not look at too directly. The wind was doing its Wyoming thing, and the lamp made its circle of warmth, and Elias ate the stew that had been kept warm for him, and thought about Margaret and what she would have said about all of this, and decided that whatever she'd have said, she would not have told him he was wrong. That was something. He was halfway through the stew when Clara came back to the table and sat down across from him. Not to eat. She'd eaten hours ago, he knew. Just to sit. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to tell me honestly." He looked up. "If this gets worse," she said, "if Hale files a claim and it goes to court, and it gets ugly and the whole town starts talking, is there a point at which you would regret keeping me on? Honestly. Not what you think you should say, what you actually think." He chewed, swallowed, set down his spoon. "No," he said. "You didn't think about it." "I already thought about it," he said. "Probably about 100 times since Hale showed up at my gate. I got the same answer every time." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because I'd rather be in the fight than watching from the fence," he said. "Always have. Margaret used to say it was my worst quality. I think it might also be my best one." He picked up his spoon again. "The stew's good." "I used the last of the salt pork," she said. "I'll get more on Saturday. I'll add it to the list." A pause that was not uncomfortable in the least. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. When this is over, he said, and he meant all of it, the debt claim and Hale and Aldous and all the various sharp edges of the situation they were in. I want you to stay on, not 1 week at a time. Permanent, if you're willing. Fair wage. The room's yours and Noah's. He wasn't looking at her when he said it, looking at the stew. The ranch runs better with you in it. The men they're different, and He stopped. The house is different, that's all. The kitchen was very quiet. I'll think about it, Clara said, and her voice was careful. And the careful in it had nothing to do with uncertainty and everything to do with the fact that she was a woman who did not say yes to important things without sitting with them first, which was something he respected about her precisely because it was also true of him. That's fair, he said. He finished the stew. She took the bowl to the basin. They said goodnight in the hallway with 3 feet of respectful distance between them, and he went to his room and she went to hers, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet. But down the hall, Elias lay with his eyes open for a long time, listening to the wind and thinking that the document in his coat pocket on the chair was one piece, and Aldrich was another piece, and Hector Voss was a third piece, and Victor Hale had not yet played whatever card he'd been holding since that visit to the gate, and the particular way he'd said husband left debts had the sound of a man who knew more than he was saying and was waiting for the right moment to use it. Something was coming. He'd been around enough bad weather to know it before it arrived. He just didn't know yet what shape it would take, or how fast, or whether what he had in his pocket and in Cheyenne and in the spare room of a retired record keeper north of Laramie would be enough when it did. What he knew, lying in the dark with the cold pressing at the window, was that he'd made his decision weeks ago without quite naming it, and that naming it now, even just to himself, even just in the dark, felt less like risk and more like the particular relief of a man who has stopped pretending he doesn't know which direction he's facing. He was in this, completely. Whatever came next, that was not a comfortable feeling. He hadn't expected it to be. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind, and somewhere down the hall, Noah made a small, contented sound in his sleep, and the house held all of them inside it. And for the first time in a long time, Elias Whitaker did not feel like a man surviving a place. He felt like a man who lived in one. The formal claim arrived on a Friday morning, delivered not by the mail rider, but by a man Elias didn't recognize, well-dressed for the territory, with the careful blankness of someone paid to deliver things without expressions. He handed the envelope to Elias at the door, said, "Mr. Whitaker," with the tone of a man completing a transaction, and rode off before Elias had finished reading the return address. Aldous Bennett, Laramie, Wyoming. Attorney at law, 1 Gerald Fitch. Elias stood on the porch in the cold and opened it. The language was formal and dense in the way legal language is when someone wants a simple thing to look complicated. Stripped of its architecture, it said this: James Bennett had died owing a sum of $412 to various creditors, the accounting of which had been compiled by his brother Aldous as executor of what little estate existed. Clara Bennett, as surviving spouse, bore legal responsibility for the outstanding balance. Payment was demanded within 30 days or legal proceedings would commence to recover assets. And if Clara had no assets, which she did not, the claim would extend to her employer as the party providing her material support. $412. Elias read that number twice. Clara had told him the real number was closer to 50, possibly less. He folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and went inside. Clara was at the stove. She knew something was wrong before he said a word. She had a way of reading the quality of a silence that he'd noticed before. The particular alertness of a woman who'd spent enough time in uncertain situations to learn what different kinds of quiet meant. She turned and looked at him. He took the letter from his pocket and put it on the table without saying anything. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up. He watched her read it. He watched the color in her face go through several changes. First a tightening, then something that might have been shock on someone less practiced at not showing shock, and then a stillness that was worse than either of those things. The stillness of a person doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the results. $412, she said. Yes. James did not owe $412. I know. She set the letter down on the table with a precision that had something controlled and furious in it. Gerald Fitch is Aldis's lawyer. He's been Aldis's lawyer for years. This isn't just a claim. This is Aldis, using Hale's money or Hale's connections or both to... She stopped. To come after me properly. Not just rumors. A legal instrument. Designed to extend to me, Elias said. Did you read that part? I read it. They're not just coming after you, he said. They're coming after the ranch. If they can make me liable for your debts under some theory of whatever Fitch's theory is, they put pressure on me to let you go, which eliminates the protection. Clara looked at him. Something in her eyes had shifted, the way things shift when a situation rearranges itself into a shape that's worse than you thought. They planned this, she said. It wasn't a question. Hale's been wanting an angle into this property for 3 years, Elias said. I told you that. I think Aldis came to him, or Hale went to Aldis, and they found each other useful. Aldis wants Noah. Hale wants leverage on me. Between them, they've got a strategy. Clara sat down in the chair. Not because she was weak. Elias had never seen this woman weak, but because sitting down was a way of gathering, of pulling everything in before you decided what to do with it. Noah was in his basket by the stove, 7 months old now, pulling at the edge of a blanket with both fists, entirely indifferent to the crisis unfolding above him. What do we do? Clara asked. I send this to Aldrich today, Elias said. He needs to know the number they're claiming so he can build a counter-argument. We have Voss's document. We need the other payments corroborated if we can. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. You said there was a payment to a man named Crane at the hardware concern. On 5th Street in Laramie, she said. $30. Late 1886, around the same time as the land office payment. Crane still running the business? I don't know. I haven't been to Laramie since March. She was thinking, visibly, the way she thought when something required all of her. There was also a payment to the grain merchant. I remembered the name after I told you I didn't. Hargrove Brothers on the south end of town. $20 partial on a balance of $50. James noted it in his ledger as paid October 86. Elias wrote the names down. That's $70 in documented payments, plus the $42 from Voss. That's $112 that can be traced. Enough to show a pattern. Enough to challenge the $412. They'll say James had other debts, Clara said. Ones we can't trace. Aldis can manufacture paper for those. Manufacturing paper is fraud, Elias said. Fraud you have to prove. Fraud that Aldrich is very good at proving, Elias said. Once he has enough legitimate evidence to establish that a pattern of fraud exists. Clara looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite trust. Trust was too simple a word for it, but something adjacent to it, something that leaned on him without quite meaning to. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. Aldis isn't just after money, she said. He told me, before I left Laramie, before I even knew about the claim, he told me that Noah should be raised by family, by him. Her voice was level. She was working hard to keep it level. He and his wife can't have children. James was his only brother. Noah is... She stopped. He said a widow with no property and no income had no business raising a child alone, that it wasn't stable, that it wasn't fair to Noah. He said this to you. Sitting in my own parlor, she said, 3 weeks after James died, while I hadn't even. She stopped again. Reset. I picked up and left because I didn't trust that he wouldn't pursue it legally. Apparently I was right. Elias was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the house, and a horse somewhere in the barn made a sound, and Noah grabbed successfully at the blanket edge and appeared profoundly satisfied by this accomplishment. He can't take Noah, Elias said. He said it flatly, not with heat, just as a fact being stated. He could try, Clara said. If he establishes that I'm financially unstable, you're employed, Elias said. Housed. Noah is fed and warm and clearly... He gestured vaguely toward the basket, where Noah had now pulled the blanket partially over his own face and seemed to find this hilarious. He's clearly not suffering. A good lawyer can make employed look like dependent, Clara said, especially if the employer is a single man and the employee is a young widow. and people are already talking. She meant Hale's gossip, the story he'd been seeding in town. Elias had known it would be weaponized eventually. He just hadn't quite calculated how elegantly it fit into the larger plan. Plant a story about impropriety, use the story to question Clara's character, use her character to question her fitness as a mother. It was, he had to admit, a well-constructed trap. Two men who each wanted different things, finding a way to pursue them simultaneously through the same set of legal maneuvers. "All right," he said. "Here's what we do. I ride to Cheyenne this week, not a letter, in person. And I sit across from Aldrich and I give him everything. Voss's document, the names in Laramie, the claim, all of it. We also—" He paused. "We need to think about your situation here, formally." Clara looked at him carefully. "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a moment. This was the part he'd been turning over since the night she'd asked him to think about what he really wanted. The night he'd told her about Margaret's sister, and felt something shift that he hadn't been able to shift back. "A single woman employed by a single man is one thing," he said carefully. "It gives Aldous and Hale a story to use. But a woman who has a more formal standing—" He stopped, because the words were getting away from him, which almost never happened. He was a man who said direct things directly, and he was currently failing at that. "I'm trying to say something and I'm doing it badly." "You're trying to say something about our arrangement," Clara said, watching him. "I'm saying that if your arrangement here were different, if you had a more—" He picked up the pen on the table and put it down again. "If we were to—" "Elias." Her voice was quiet. He looked at her. "Are you trying to say that if we were married," she said, just as quietly, "it would be harder for Aldous to call me unstable?" He held her gaze. "That's part of what I'm saying." "What's the other part?" The kitchen was very still. Noah had gotten the blanket entirely off his face and was regarding the ceiling with solemn intensity, as though it had said something interesting. "The other part," Elias said, "is that I've been in this kitchen more in the last 6 weeks than I've been in it in 3 years. And the house is— I said this before. The house is different. And I'm not doing this calculation by accident, Clara. I know the difference between a practical argument and a reason." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the table, that same posture, the gathering of things posture he'd come to recognize. "James has been gone 7 months," she said. "I know that." "This isn't— I'm not ready to call it what it might be," she said. "I'm not sure what it is." "Neither am I," he said. "I'm not asking you to name it." "But you're asking me to marry you." "I'm asking you to consider it," he said. "As a practical matter first, if that's how you need to approach it. As a protection. And if other things—" He stopped. "I'm not in a hurry. I've waited 3 years alone. I can wait longer." Clara looked down at her hands, then over at Noah, then back at Elias. "Give me time to think," she said. "Take it," he said. He got up and picked up the claim letter from the table. "I'll get this to Aldrich. That's the first thing." He went to write the letter, and Clara stayed at the table, and neither of them said anything more about it, and the kitchen held the conversation like a room holds warmth after a fire, present, still, not quite willing to go. He rode to Cheyenne 2 days later. It was a hard 2 days on the road in December, cold that required focus, and a horse that had opinions about the footing on the frozen trail, and Elias arrived in Cheyenne stiff and short-tempered and in no mood for the particular brand of legal caution that some lawyers used as a substitute for commitment. Aldrich was not that kind of lawyer. He was a narrow man in his 50s, with the contained energy of someone who had learned to make very small movements accomplish large things. He had an office on the 3rd floor of a building on Capitol Avenue, and he read the claim letter in 4 minutes, and then looked up at Elias with the expression of a man who has recognized a species of problem he's encountered before. "Fitch," he said, "you know him?" "I know of him," Aldrich said. "He has a reputation for building paper cases on factual foundations that have been—" He considered his word. "Improved. Tell me about the widow." Elias told him. All of it. The real debt, the payment records taken during the move, Voss and his duplicate receipts, the names Crane and Hargrove brothers in Laramie, the connection to Hale, whom Aldrich also knew of, and to Aldous Bennett, and the custody angle underneath the debt claim. Aldrich listened without interruption, which was one of the more valuable things a lawyer could do. When Elias finished, Aldrich tapped the desk once with one finger. "Voss is your strongest piece," he said. "The land office record is official, and he's a credible witness. If Crane and Hargrove brothers can corroborate payments of comparable legitimacy, we have a pattern strong enough to challenge the inflated total." He leaned back. "The custody question is separate from the debt question and will need to be handled separately, but they're connected strategically. If we discredit the debt claim, we undermine the financial instability argument they'd use in custody." "How long?" Elias asked. "If they move to file formally in 30 days as the letter threatens, we respond within that window. I'll need to contact Voss directly, and someone needs to visit Crane and Hargrove brothers." He looked at Elias. "Can you do Laramie again?" "If I need to." "You'll need to." Aldrich picked up a pen. "I'll draft formal correspondence to Fitch challenging the claim and requesting documentation of each individual debt cited. That forces them to produce their paper, and whatever paper they produce, we look at against the payment evidence you bring me." He paused. "There's one more thing." Elias waited. "You mentioned Hale," Aldrich said. "I want to be careful here because I can't prove what I'm about to say, but I've seen this structure before. A powerful local figure with an existing grievance, a distant family member with a separate claim, the two finding each other useful." He set the pen down. "Hale has a reason to want leverage on you. Does he have any legal mechanism of his own against Mrs. Bennett? Anything independent of the debt claim?" Elias thought about it. "Not that I know of." "Then his role is pressure, not law," Aldrich said. "He's providing the network, the gossip in town, possibly the connection to Fitch. But the legal instrument belongs to Aldous Bennett, which means if the legal instrument fails, Hale loses his tool." He almost smiled. "Men like Hale are less dangerous when they have to fight directly." Elias rode home from Cheyenne with a different quality of cold than the kind he'd ridden therein. Still the same temperature, but the ride back felt purposeful in a way the ride out had not, because the ride out had been fear dressed up as action, and the ride back was something closer to a plan. He got home late on a Thursday night to find the kitchen dark and the house quiet, except for a lamp left burning in the hallway. Left burning for him, he understood, because it hadn't been there before she came, and it was there every time he came in late now. He stood in the hallway for a moment looking at the lamp. Then Dewey appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, which meant he'd been watching for Elias's return, hat at the neutral angle of someone carrying news he hadn't decided how to characterize yet. "Aldous Bennett came today," Dewey said. Everything in Elias went still. "When?" "About 2 in the afternoon, him and 2 other men. One of them was probably a lawyer the way he held his papers." Dewey paused. "Mrs. Bennett was here alone. Me and Cal were in the south pasture." "What happened?" "She didn't let them pass the porch," Dewey said, and there was something in his voice, something almost like admiration, which was not a thing Dewey expressed often or easily. "Stood in the doorway with Noah and told them they were on private property without the owner's permission, and if they had legal business, it could go through her lawyer in Cheyenne." He turned his hat in his hands once. "Aldous said some things. About her fitness. About Noah. About what the court would think of a woman in her situation." "And?" Elias said, because Dewey had stopped. "And she told him," Dewey said carefully, "that the next time he came onto this property without an invitation, he should bring a judge with him because that was the only man whose opinion of her situation she was interested in hearing." Elias stood in the hallway. "And then she shut the door," Dewey said. "And I could hear from where I came up to the yard that Aldous was not, that he said more things outside the closed door. Loud things." He paused. "I walked up to the porch at that point and asked if there was something I could help him with." "Did he leave?" "He left," Dewey said. "He wasn't happy about it." Elias looked at the lamp. "How is she?" Dewey considered. "Fine," he said, "or doing a good job of looking it, which with her I sometimes can't tell the difference." He put his hat back on. "She fed us a good supper either way." Dewey went back to the bunkhouse. Elias hung his coat and went down the hall and knocked once on Clara's door. A pause. Then, "Come in." She was sitting by the small window with Noah in her lap, the baby not asleep but quiet, looking up at her with the concentrated attention he gave things that interested him. and her expression when she looked up at Elias was steady and composed and tired in a way that was underneath the composure, visible only because he'd learned to look for it. "Dewey told you," she said. "He did." "I handled it," she said, slightly defensive, which was the one quality that was not her usual register, and he understood it. She didn't want to be asked if she was all right, didn't want to be managed, and he understood that too. "I know you handled it," he said. "I'm not here because I think you couldn't." She looked at him for a moment. Then something in her shoulders changed, slightly, a degree of release. "He's meaner in person," she said. "Aldous." Then I remembered. She looked down at Noah. He looked at Noah the way people look at something they own, like Noah is an inheritance to him, not a child. Her jaw tightened. "He called me reckless, for leaving Laramie without telling him, for taking Noah 12 miles outside of town to live with a man he doesn't know." "And you told him about the lawyer," Elias said. "I told him we had a lawyer," she said. "I don't know if he believed me." "He'll believe it when Aldrich's letter reaches Fitch," Elias said. "That should happen by end of next week." He stepped inside and sat in the chair across from her, the same 3 feet of careful distance, which had somehow become their natural geography. "Aldrich is confident about the Voss document. He thinks if we can get corroboration from Crane and Hargrove brothers, we can challenge the full amount." He paused. "I'm going to Laramie again. Next week." "Elias?" "I know," he said. "I'll be careful about Aldous." "That's not what I was going to say." She held his gaze. "I was going to say thank you. I've been trying to find a way to say it that doesn't sound insufficient. There isn't one." She looked at Noah. "What you're doing for us, don't," he said, because she'd been doing what she'd told him not to do, which was undersell the thing. "I have to say it," she said. "I'm not good at owing things without naming them." A pause. "You're a good man. I want you to know I see that. Not just what you're doing, the reason behind it." The lamp was low, and Noah had fallen asleep against Clara's arm with the sudden completeness of infants, and the window showed nothing but dark and cold, and Elias sat across from a woman who had stood in a doorway and sent away 2 men and a lawyer with nothing but her own nerve and the certain knowledge that she had someone in her corner. "I've been thinking," Clara said into the quiet, "about what you asked." He waited. "I haven't stopped thinking about it," she said. "If I'm honest." He didn't say anything. "I need you to understand," she said carefully, "that if I said yes, it wouldn't be only for the legal reason. I want to be clear about that. Because I've done things for practical reasons when they were the only option, and I don't want to do this as only a practical reason." The quiet was so complete he could hear the lamp. "And I need more time," she said. "Not forever, but more." "Okay," he said. "You're not going to push." "No," he said. She looked at him with those dark, assessing eyes that had looked at the ranch that very first day and decided whether it was better or worse than the last place. "Why not?" "Because pushing is what Aldous does," Elias said, "and I've got no interest in being anything like him." Something moved across her face, quick and unguarded, the kind of expression that appears before a person can arrange it. "Go to sleep," he said. "I'll be here when you wake up." He got up and went to the door. "Elias," she said. He stopped. "I'm glad the stagecoach stopped here," she said, "for what it's worth." He was quiet for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. "So am I," he said, and meant it all the way down. He pulled the door closed and stood in the hallway, and somewhere outside the cold was doing what the cold does in Wyoming in December, and the lamp was burning at the end of the hall, and tomorrow there was work to be done, and a trip to plan and a lawyer's case to build, and a man in Laramie who had shown up on his porch today looking at a baby like property. That man had not yet understood what he was dealing with. He had not yet understood that Elias Whitaker, once he decided to fight something, did not stop. And he had not yet understood that Clara Bennett, standing in a doorway with a baby on her hip and nothing in her hands but her own word, was not a woman who could be managed or maneuvered or frightened into surrender. He was going to understand it. Soon enough. Elias went to bed and slept better than he had in weeks. The second trip to Laramie was colder than the first, which Elias hadn't thought possible, but Wyoming had a way of correcting that kind of assumption. He rode out on a Monday before dawn, the kind of dark that isn't quite night anymore but hasn't committed to morning, and the horse moved through it with the resigned competence of an animal that has learned not to expect good weather. He found Crane's hardware concern on 5th Street still operating, run now by the son rather than the father, who had passed the previous spring. The son was a young man named Douglas, who had his father's record books because, as he put it, he wasn't yet sure which ones mattered and hadn't gotten around to going through them. He found the transaction in 20 minutes, $30 cash, paid in person by James Bennett in October 1886, for hardware supplies including iron fittings and feed nails, with a receipt issued and signed. The entry was in the father's handwriting, methodical and clear. Douglas Crane made a copy of the entry, signed it himself as attestation of the original record, and handed it over with the practical generosity of a man who understood that records existed to be used. Hargrove Brothers was harder. The grain merchant on the south end had changed hands twice since 1886, and the current owner, a humorless man named Pettigrew, had no interest in old records and initially said so with some force. It took Elias 20 minutes of patient conversation, patient in the way that costs something, the kind of patient that has actually controlled irritation, before Pettigrew admitted that the previous owner had left several crates of ledgers in the back storeroom that nobody had touched. Another 40 minutes of searching through boxes that smelled of dust and old grain produced an entry for James Bennett. $20 partial payment, October 1886, balance noted. Signed by a clerk whose name was no longer verifiable but whose handwriting matched the style of every other entry in the book. It wasn't as clean as Voss's duplicate receipt or Crane's signed attestation, but it existed. Elias stood in Pettigrew's storeroom with both documents in his hand and thought about Clara at her kitchen table with her brown notebook, writing down the cost of every meal, keeping meticulous track of what she owed. And he thought about James Bennett, who had apparently been the same kind of person, a man who counted every bill twice and made them write him a receipt and kept a ledger with every payment noted, and about how completely Aldous had bet against the record-keeping instincts of a man who had, it turned out, documented himself into evidence even after death. He rode to Aldrich's office in Cheyenne on the way back, left both documents, sat across from the lawyer while Aldrich read them, and then stacked them with the Voss receipt and tapped the pile once with his finger. "This is enough," Aldrich said. "Enough to win?" "Enough to make the fraudulent nature of the claim demonstrable," Aldrich said. $112 in verified payments, plus the Voss document, against a claim balance of $412. The disparity isn't an error, it's a fabrication, and I can show that. He looked at Elias over his glasses. "I'm going to request a hearing. I want this in front of a judge, not settled quietly. Quiet settlements serve men like Hale and Bennett because they don't produce public records." "When?" 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the court calendar. He set his glasses down. "There's one more thing I want to address before you go." Elias waited. "The custody element," Aldrich said. "Aldous Bennett has not yet filed a formal custody claim, but the language in Fitch's letter leans toward it. If he's going to file, he'll likely do it concurrent with or immediately following the debt hearing, trying to use whatever momentum the debt case gives him, in either direction." He paused. "I want to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer." "Ask it." "What is Mrs. Bennett's situation at Greystone Ranch?" Aldrich said. "I'm not asking about propriety, and I'm not making a judgment. I'm asking because the answer affects my strategy. A woman who is an employee is more vulnerable to Aldous' stability argument than a woman who is a spouse. I want to know which one I'm defending." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I've asked her," he said. "She's thinking about it." Aldrich studied him. "And if she says yes before the hearing?" "Then I'd appreciate knowing what paperwork you need," Elias said. Aldrich almost smiled. It was the closest thing to warmth the man displayed. "I'll have it ready," he said. "Chet." He got home on a Wednesday evening, 2 days of hard riding in the kind of cold that made the barn feel luxurious by comparison. He unsaddled the horse himself, rubbed him down, gave him extra feed because the animal had earned it, and then stood in the barn for a few minutes, not quite ready to go in. It wasn't reluctance. It was the opposite of reluctance, which was the problem. He was aware, standing in the barn with the smell of hay and horse and cold, that the pull toward the house, toward the light in the kitchen window, toward the sound of someone moving around inside, was something he had no more interest in pretending wasn't there. He went in. Clara was at the stove. Noah was in his basket on the table, awake and investigating his own fingers with the grave concentration of a philosopher. The kitchen smelled like roasting meat and something with onions, and Dewey and Pete and Garrett were already at the table, which meant it was close to supper, which meant he'd timed the return reasonably well. Clara turned when he came in. She read his face the way she'd learned to read it. "You got them," she said. "Both of them," he said. He reached into his coat and laid the documents on the table next to Noah's basket. She came to look at them, not touching them, reading them where they lay. Pete Colburn said, "Are those the papers that fixed the thing with the—" and then caught Dewey's look and stopped. "Yes," Elias said. "Good," Pete said, with the quiet sincerity of a man who had been worried about something he didn't entirely understand and was relieved to see progress. Clara straightened. She looked at Elias, and something in her eyes was doing the complicated thing again, the thing he'd stopped trying to categorize. "Aldrich says it's enough," Elias said. "He's requesting a hearing." "How long?" 4 to 6 weeks. She nodded, picked up the documents carefully and held them, and he could see her doing what she did, accounting for things, weighing them, deciding what they meant. Then she set them back down and went to the stove because supper was ready, and the men came to the table, and Noah waved a fist at nothing in particular, and the kitchen was what the kitchen had become: alive, occupied, full of the specific noise of people sharing a meal who have grown accustomed to each other. Later, after the men had gone and the kitchen was cleaned and Noah was down for the night, Clara came to the parlor doorway. Elias was at the desk with the ranch ledger, not because it needed urgent attention, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. She stood in the doorway, the same way she'd stood in it that first night she told him about Aldous. Except this time she came into the room. She sat on the horsehair settee, Margaret's settee, the one Elias almost never used, and folded her hands in her lap. "I've been thinking," she said. He set down the pen. "I want to tell you where I am," she said, "because you deserve that, and because I'm tired of carrying it around without saying it." He waited. "James was a good man," she said. "I meant that when I said it. He was kind, and he was honest, and he loved Noah from the moment he knew he was coming, even though he didn't get to know him." She looked at her hands. "I'm not over losing him. I don't think that's the kind of thing you get over in 7 months, or maybe ever. I think you just carry it differently as time goes on." "Yes," Elias said. He knew exactly what she meant. "But I'm also—" She stopped, restarted. "I notice things," she said, "about you. I've been noticing them for weeks and telling myself it was just proximity or gratitude or the fact that you're the first person in a long time who's acted like I was worth the trouble." She looked up. "But I think it's more than that. And I think you know that I think that, and I think you've been waiting for me to say it." "I've been waiting," he agreed. "I'm scared," she said. "That's the honest version. I'm scared because the last time I trusted a situation to hold, it didn't. And I know that's not— I know James's death wasn't a failure of trust, it was just—" She pressed her hands together. "But knowing it and feeling it are different things, and I don't want to bring my fear into something as your problem." "Clara," he said, "my problem right now, if we're naming problems, is that I've fallen in love with a woman who I think might feel something similar, and I've been trying to be patient about it, which is not something I'm constitutionally suited to." He said it with the bluntness of a man who has finished working around something and decided to walk directly at it. "I'm not asking you not to be scared. I'm asking if the scared is something you're willing to feel alongside the rest of it." The parlor was quiet. The lamp on the desk made a small circle of yellow light. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "It is." He let that sit for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It was not a romantic scene in the way that people imagine romantic scenes. He didn't cross the room and she didn't stand up dramatically. They were two people in a parlor at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, both of them tired and complicated and carrying the specific weight of people who had loved before and knew how much it cost, and what they had between them was real and therefore not simple, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "I'll say yes," she said, "to what you asked, but I want it to be for the right reasons, and I want you to know—" She met his eyes. "The right reasons are not the legal ones. Those are convenient. The right reason is what you said, that you've been coming into the kitchen more than you need to, and so have I." He almost smiled. "You've been coming into the barn." "I have questions about the horses," she said, without blinking. "You don't know anything about horses." "I've been learning," she said, and this time she almost smiled back. The real one, not the shadow of one, and it changed her entire face. They were married on a Saturday in February, in the front room of the Cutters Creek Courthouse, in a civil ceremony that took 12 minutes and was witnessed by Dewey, Pete, and the judge's secretary who happened to be passing and was asked to stay. Clara wore her best dress, which was a dark green wool that she had mended at the cuffs herself, and which suited her in a way that made Pete Colburn go entirely quiet for several minutes afterward, which was the most eloquent compliment he was capable of. Noah wore a blanket and expressed no opinion on the proceedings. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon, the four of them: Elias, Clara, Noah, and Dewey, who had taken the position of driver with the hat at the back-tilted angle of a man who was satisfied with how things had turned out. And the winter fields went past, gray and brown and bare, and Clara sat beside Elias with her shoulder against his and Noah in her lap. And Elias held the reins loosely because Dewey was driving and there was nothing else that needed his hands right now. "Regrets?" Clara said, low enough that only he could hear. "Not one," he said. "It's been 12 minutes. "No regrets in 12 minutes, he said. "I'll report back at 20. She made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, small and real and slightly surprised at itself, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh today and found it happening anyway. The hearing was in March. Aldrich had done what Aldrich did, assembled the evidence into a case that was clear enough that its clarity was itself an argument, the kind of case where the facts, laid in order, made the opposition look not just wrong but deliberate. Boss came from north of Laramie, neat in a brown suit with his duplicate receipt and 31 years of record-keeping patience. Douglas Crane came from Cutters Creek with his father's ledger entry. The Hargrove brothers' record was submitted in documentation. Against this, Fitch produced a handwritten accounting of debts attributed to James Bennett totaling $412, with no receipts, no corroborating ledgers, no witness to any transaction, and a provenance that traced entirely to Aldous Bennett's personal recollection of his dead brother's financial affairs. The judge was a man named Calloway, who had been on the bench in that territory for 16 years and had the specific patience of someone who had watched a great many people try to do through courts what they couldn't do through honest means. He read everything. He asked precise questions. He gave Fitch extended opportunity to produce documentation that did not exist. Then he ruled. Clara owed nothing. The debt as claimed was not substantiated. The documentation provided by the claimant was insufficient to establish the existence of the obligations as stated, and the evidence presented in rebuttal was sufficient to establish a pattern of payment inconsistent with the claim balance. Case dismissed. He also noted, in language that Aldrich later told Elias was unusually direct for a written ruling, that the disparity between the claimed amount and the verified payments raised questions about the accuracy of the accounting that the court found concerning. He didn't use the word fraud. He didn't need to. Aldous Bennett sat in the second row of the courtroom and went through several shades of a man who had been very confident and is now recalibrating. Victor Hale was not present. Men like Hale did not attend the proceedings of things they'd funded when those things were going wrong. But his absence was its own kind of presence, and everyone who knew the shape of the situation understood it. After the ruling, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Aldous made one more attempt. He came toward Clara with the expression of a man who had decided that losing gracefully was still a form of engagement he was entitled to. He was red in the face. "This isn't over," he said. "Noah is James's son, James's blood." "You don't have the—" "Mr. Bennett," Elias said. Aldous stopped. Elias was not a tall man particularly, not the kind of physically imposing figure that makes rooms go quiet by size alone. But he had the quality that some men have, a stillness, a settled quality, that communicates something more permanent than size. "My wife and my son are going home," he said. He said "my wife and my son" without emphasis or performance, just as accurate descriptions of facts. If you'd like to discuss James's memory in a way that's respectful of it, you can write to us. If you'd like to attempt another legal instrument, you'll hear from Aldrich. He paused. But I'd suggest you think carefully before spending more of your money on a judge in this territory, because you've now been in front of one, and the record of how that went exists. Aldous looked at him, then at Clara, then at Noah, asleep in Clara's arms with the absolute indifference of a baby who had slept through his own vindication. He left without saying anything else. Clara stood in the courthouse hallway with Noah and watched Aldous walk away, and she didn't look triumphant or relieved exactly. She looked like a woman who had been braced for a long time and was only now beginning to understand she could unbrace. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way those things happen, in degrees, like a fist slowly opening. "It's done," Elias said. "It's done," she said, and exhaled. Victor Hale's angle collapsed without Aldis's legal case to run through. There was nothing left to file, no instrument, no debt, no claim on Greystone Ranch. Whatever plan had existed between the two men, and it had existed, Aldrich confirmed, in the loose way that things can be confirmed when a lawyer pays attention to patterns. It required the debt claim as its foundation, and without the foundation it was just Victor Hale's general desire to make trouble, which was not actionable. Hale came to Elias in April, in town, at the feed store, and said, in his easy, pleasant way, that he hoped there were no hard feelings about the winter's business. Elias bought his feed and said, "Victor, I don't carry hard feelings. They're heavy, and I've got enough to carry." He rode home. The gossip in Cutter's Creek had the short memory that gossip usually has. The story about the widow and the rancher had a new chapter now that was more interesting than the old one. They were married, the baby was healthy, the ranch was running well, and people reconfigured their opinions in the way people do when the facts insist on it. There were a few who maintained their disapproval, because some people need something to disapprove of, and the specific target matters less than the feeling. Elias paid them approximately the attention they deserved, which was none. Spring arrived the way spring arrives in Wyoming, not all at once, but in arguments, warm days followed by cold snaps, the ground soft in the afternoon and frozen again by morning. The cattle came back to the south fields. The fence that Dewey had repaired 3 times held. The stove's left burner, which Elias had fixed in November, held 2. Pete Colburn planted something near the bunkhouse that he claimed would be flowers by June, and while nobody entirely believed him, nobody said so. Noah learned to sit up in April. He accomplished this with the focused determination of someone who has decided that the world looks different from vertical and intends to see it that way. He was 8 months old and had the specific presence of a baby who was always paying attention, taking in the ranch hands and the barn sounds and the smell of bread and the quality of afternoon light with the same solemn intensity, as if he was cataloging it all for later. Elias started holding him. It happened without announcement, the way things at Greystone Ranch had a habit of happening. One evening, Clara needed both hands for something and handed Noah to Elias without asking if he was ready, and Elias took him because the alternative was letting him fall, and Noah looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes and grabbed Elias's thumb with a grip that was, for an 8-month-old, remarkably committed. He stood there holding the baby for a while after Clara had finished what she was doing, and she came back and watched him and didn't say anything, which was the right choice. "He's heavier than he looks," Elias said, eventually. "He's been eating well," Clara said. "He has," Elias agreed. He handed Noah back. But the next time Clara needed both hands, she handed the baby over again. And this time Elias sat down with him, and Noah grabbed the button on his shirt and attempted to remove it with the steady purposefulness of a small person who has identified an achievable goal. "He's going to get that button," Clara said from the stove. "He's not getting that button," Elias said. He got the button. Well, Old Royce found Elias in the barn on an evening in May, when the light was going gold and long across the fields, the particular light that makes Wyoming look like a painting of itself, and stood beside him at the fence rail looking out at the cattle. "This ranch is different," Royce said. "Yes," Elias said. "Better different," Royce said. "Not just the food, though the food is considerably better. I want to be clear about that." "You've been clear about that," Elias said. Royce leaned on the fence. "Margaret would have liked her," he said. "Just so you know, somebody should say it." Elias was quiet for a moment. The cattle moved in the field, unhurried, and somewhere in the house Noah was making his increasingly complex conversational sounds. the ones that were almost but not quite words yet, and Clara's voice answered him, low and patient. "I know," Elias said. "I think about that sometimes." "Thought you might," Royce said, and pushed off the fence and went back to the bunkhouse, hat back, which meant things were fine. Elias stayed at the fence a while longer. He thought about Margaret the way he still did, not with the grief that used to sit on it like something crushing, but with the different kind of ache that is just love with nowhere current to go. He thought about what she'd said about his worst quality, that once he got an idea in his head, it calcified. He supposed she'd been right. He supposed the same quality that made him stubborn also made him capable of standing at a gate when a woman with a baby and no money stepped off a stagecoach and deciding, without quite knowing he was deciding, not to send her away. He'd never been good at the easy thing when the right thing was available. He went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table with Noah in her lap, the brown notebook open beside her. She was writing something in it, and when Elias came in, she looked up and then looked back down, and he could see that the column of numbers in the notebook had a line drawn through it. She'd settled the account. In her own head, in her own way, in the private ledger she'd been keeping since November. Whatever she felt she'd owed, the lawyer, the room, the lamp in the hallway, she'd apparently decided it was paid. He didn't say anything about it. A person was allowed their private books. He pulled out the chair across from her, the same chair, the same 3 feet of table between them, except that it wasn't 3 feet anymore. Not in the way it had been. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he said. Noah looked between them with his grave, cataloging attention and made a sound that was not quite a word but was shaped like one. And Clara laughed, and Elias found himself laughing too, briefly, the honest kind that doesn't announce itself. Outside, the Wyoming spring was doing what Wyoming springs do, arguing with winter, losing some days and winning others, moving in the direction of warmth by inches. The cattle were in the field. The fence was holding. The left burner on the stove worked. The lamp at the end of the hall would be lit later, the way it was lit every night now, not because anyone was coming in late, but because a light left burning for someone is its own kind of statement. None of it was perfect. The roof needed work in 2 places. Garrett's cough had come back. The price the broker was offering for spring cattle was lower than it should have been. There was always something that needed doing, something that hadn't held, something that required more patience than a person felt they had. That was the truth of it. Not the version where everything resolves into ease, but the actual version, where things are better and still imperfect and worth it anyway. Where you choose the difficulty because the alternative is a life so carefully protected from risk that nothing real can get in. Elias had spent 3 years protecting himself from risk. He knew what it bought him. Silence. Rooms that were clean but not used. A kitchen that smelled like nothing. He reached across the table and touched Clara's hand briefly, the way you touch something you're still getting used to having. She turned her hand over and held his for a moment, and Noah grabbed at their joined hands with both of his, not understanding what it meant but recognizing that it was something. It was. It was something. That was enough.